Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be taking our first look at Autodesk Maya. First we're going to learn how to set up our project properly, and we're going to take a look at some of the interface of Maya, and we'll do a bit of overview on the basics of modeling. However, before we get into any of that, it's important that we start by creating a project folder. And a project folder is basically a folder on your PC that Maya can automatically set up with specifically named subfolders, which Maya will then save files to automatically and will expect files to be when you open up your project again the next time. So to create a project file, I'm going to go up to File. I'm going to go down here to the bottom and select Project Window, and it gives me this pop-up. When you first boot up Maya, it will automatically be set to a default project, which is stored in your Documents folder, but you really don't want to be working from the default project, as it can be cluttered if all of your working files are in the same exact place. So instead, we're going to hit New. We're going to type in a new project, something recognizable to you, and I'm going to find a location for this. So just select the directory I want. Then once I hit accept, it will create a folder with all of these different subfolders included. So I'm just going to hit accept. And if I pull in that folder in my Windows Explorer, I can open up the project window, and here's all of those subfolders that Maya is going to be looking for. So for example, all of your scenes that you save will be automatically saved to your scenes folder. Any images that you render out will be saved to your images folder. Any movies that you render will be saved to movies. And if you are adding any images to Maya, it will look for them in the source images folder, not to be confused with the images folder. Most of these folders are pretty self-explanatory by their name, but the distinction between source images and images can be a little bit tricky. So just remember that images is for outputs, source images is for inputs. The importance of having a project folder is that Maya is set up to look for certain types of files in those subfolders that it created. So because Maya works like this, where it is looking for certain file types within certain subfolders of a central project folder, you will need to tell Maya when you start it up which project folder you're working from. You can't just open a scene in Maya and expect it to know where everything is based on the scene file. You need to start with the project folder. So to tell Maya what project folder you're working from, you go up to File, and underneath the project window is Set Project. And I will open up this window where you can select the project folder for your entire Maya project. It's set. When you create a project, it'll automatically set your project. And if you're working on the same computer consistently, it will often remember which project you set. But sometimes Maya can forget. So it's good to double check when you are starting to make sure to set your project. If you don't set your project and you just open up a scene folder, you'll often get a lot of missing textures and missing reference files and things like that, which can cause a lot of headache for you. So always be really, really conscious of having a project folder and setting it when you start. Next, let's talk about the Maya interface. Now, the Maya interface is very, very complex. There's a lot of different buttons, but you will find in time that a lot of the buttons are just duplicates of the same button, but put in different places. So, for example, taking an early look at the modeling toolkit over here, there's a button here to combine objects. And that same button is up here in the poly modeling shelf and up here in mesh. So while Maya is very complicated and appears so right at a glance, you'll find over time that a lot of these buttons are just the same button in different places. So to start, let's talk about the top bar of menus. So first we have File, which works like you would expect in most of these sort of creative programs. You can save your scene here, load scenes. You can export things from your scene. And of course, you can create projects and set your project here. Next, we have Edit, which has the typical undo and redo, cut, copy, paste, so on and so forth, delete, duplicate. All of these have hotkeys as well, but if you're just looking for these basic functions, you can find them up here. Next we have create, and here you can find any sort of object you want to create in your scene. So we have polygon primitives, which are all the different shapes you could make in Maya. You have lights, cameras, locators, that sort of thing. Next we have select, which has the option to select everything in your scene, or you can select all of the objects of a certain type in your scene, like you can select all the cameras or all the lights. Moving down a couple menus, we have windows, where we can find a variety of menus that are not initially shown to us. We don't need to worry about these too much. We can cross any bridges as we get to them. But at the very least, it's good to know that down here under Settings/Preferences, you can find the Preferences menu, which can be good if you need to make any tweaks to Maya itself. Also under Windows, you have Workspaces, which lets you switch between different basic templates for how all of these windows are arranged. So for example, if you were UV editing, you could change Maya to a UV editing mode. I don't know, that doesn't make sense right now, but we'll go over that later. But the point is, if anything gets messed up and you're not sure how to fix it, you can go back to Maya Classic and then say my modeling toolkit is hovering, or it's down here and I don't want it there because it's taking up too much space that way. I can go to Windows, Workspaces, reset Maya Classic to factory default. And that's how you get everything to look the same as it was. Except it did close my outliner on the left. So if you ever missed this, the button to access the outliner is right there. After Windows, we have Mesh, Edit Mesh, Mesh Tools, Mesh Display, and several other menus that all relate back to modeling. Now, when you start up Maya, the software is configured to be most convenient for modeling. So it displays modeling menus right out the gate. However, there are more menus that can go up here in this top bar than just modeling tools. And we can change between those by going over to here, opening up this drop-down menu, and selecting a different set of options. So if I were animating, I go to the animation set of menus. And now I have options for keyframes and playback and audio. Options that were hidden to me before when I was in the modeling mode. Once again, we're not going to worry about these until later, but just for now, be aware that your menus are set up for what you're doing at the moment. So now that we've taken a look at the menus, let's next move on to the viewport. So the viewport is essentially your window into the scene. And to show off some of the features and how to navigate the viewport, I'm going to go ahead and start by creating a cube. To create a cube, I'm going to go up here to the poly modeling shelf. There's several different shelves here, but today we're just going to worry about the poly modeling shelf. I'm going to hit this cube to create a cube. So to move my camera around the cube, I'm going to hold Alt, and then with my left mouse, middle mouse, and right mouse buttons, I can navigate through the scene. So if I hold left click, I can rotate around where my camera is centered, which right now is on the cube. If I hold Alt and middle click, I can pan around the scene. And if I hold Alt and right click, I can zoom in and out. I can also zoom in and out with the scroll wheel, if you prefer that instead. If I have panned really far away and lost my cube, but I know it's still selected, I can press F to focus back in on my selection. And I know it's selected because it has a green highlight over the wireframe of this cube. I can also tell if it's selected by checking my outliner. The outliner is essentially a list of all the objects in my scene. And that outliner is by default on the left here, and can be accessed by pressing this square button if you're missing it. So if I were to delete this cube by pressing the delete key, it would disappear from my outliner as well as from the scene. I'm going to hit Control Z to bring it back. Now let's talk about how to transform this cube a little bit. So in Maya, the three main transformation modes are translation, rotation, and scale. These can be accessed with the W key for translate, the E key for rotate, and the R key for scale. So each of these modes has a corresponding gizmo associated with it. And say I just go to translate, it has arrows. I can grab one of these arrows and drag my cube along that axis. If I grab one of these squares, I can move the cube along 2 axes. And if I grab the square in the middle, I can move it parallel to my camera across 3 axes. Pressing E again to go to rotate, I have these circles, and each of these lets me rotate along each of these axes. And then this outer one lets me rotate in relation to the camera. And pressing R, we have scale. Works a lot like transform. Works a lot like translate. If I grab one of these handles, I can scale in specific directions. Or I could scale from the middle to scale in all directions. It's important to note that in Maya, we are working in a XYZ coordinate system. That means that everything is essentially on a grid in 3 dimensions. So you can't see the 3rd dimension on this grid, but you can see there are 2 of the 3 dimensions on the grid shown here. And if you look down in the very corner of your screen, there's a little gizmo here that shows you which direction is which in your scene. So the x-axis is represented in red. So if I look at the gizmo, I can tell that the x-axis goes this way. The y-axis is vertical, and it is in green, so it goes this way. And then the z-axis is in blue, and it goes this way. So if you're ever lost about which direction is which in your scene, be sure to check down here in the bottom left corner of your viewport. If you're tired of using the translate, scale, and rotate tools, you could also press Q to go to your selection mode. And selection mode basically lets you still select your object, but it doesn't let you transform it accidentally. Now, W, E, and R are not the only ways to alter your shapes in the scene. You could also go up here to the right under this tab channel box / a layer editor. I'm going to click that, and you'll see there are boxes where I can input values for the translation on each of my axes, as well as the rotation and the scale. So, for example, if I click here and just type in translation of 10, it moves my cube 10 units on the x-axis positively in the x-axis. Maya works in real-world units, so by default, this is in centimeters. So I've just moved it by 10 centimeters to the left. Hit 0 and go back. If I click and drag from the middle point between the name of the value and the box, I can use my mouse to drag the number up and down, though it can get kind of out of control very quickly. So just be a little careful with that. And if I want to alter more than one value at a time, I can click and drag over multiple boxes and then type the value I want into the last box. Or if I wanted to, I could control select these various boxes and only alter the ones that I have selected that way. Now you find just under all of these transformation values is a section labeled inputs. And inputs are essentially the history of every little thing you've done to that object that has altered it in some way. That doesn't typically include transformations like we just did, but if you're changing the geometry in some way, then that will start to accrue inputs or history. However, if you're working with a fresh object, there should just be one input, and that is, in the case of a cube, polycube 1. So I'm going to click that, and this is essentially the history of creating the cube. And when you create the cube, and when I created the cube, I could have had the option to change some of the values about how it created it. Specifically in terms of how large it is, how wide it is, or how tall it is, and how high resolution it is. And when I access this input, I can go in and alter some of the values of that input. So for example, I could go in and select these values and make the cube bigger in that way. And notice that didn't change my scale. Increase the height and the width however I want. And not only that, I can change the resolution. And so by increasing the subdivisions, height, width, and depth, I can add more edges and vertices to the middle of my cube. Now, inputs can be really useful, but they can also be really detrimental. As you start to work on a model more and more, it will accrue more and more of this history that will build up and increase the processing power needed to run Maya, just having the object in the scene. And so if you keep working, eventually you could end up with hundreds of these little inputs of history on your object that are really not useful to you. Because most of the time you're not going to be working in this method where you go back in your inputs and change things all the time. So what's often good to do is if you're working on a model like this, is you want to be frequently deleting your history. And to delete your history, you can go up to Edit, Delete by Type, History. And that deletes the input. Or there's a faster way to delete your history. I'm going to undo that real quick. And then I'm going to go up to here in the bottom line shelf. This button in the middle right here, Delete by Type, History. And just like that, it's gone. This is just a standard part of the modeling process, and it's expected that you clear your history pretty frequently so that your system doesn't get bogged down and slow down your working pace. There's two more buttons up here that I want to talk about. The one to the right of Delete by Type History is the Freeze Transformations button. Now, every object in Maya has sort of a default position that it's supposed to be. And when you create that object, that default position will be at the absolute 0 position in your scene. The 0, 0, 0 coordinate. And then as I move my object and I rotate it, you can see it's now no longer at the 0, 0, 0 coordinate, either for the translation or at the 0, 0, 0 rotation. It's no longer at its default. This is the variation or the local translation or the local rotation of this object. Now, say if I'm working in a scene and this is like a building and it's really supposed to be right here for the remainder of the scene, just theoretically. And I wanted this to be its default position and rotation. What I can do is I can hit Freeze Transformations, and it zeroes everything out over here while not moving the object at all. So now this is its new position in the world. And you can see the rotation axis changed, so now it is more in line with the world rotation. And if I were to move this around again, I could then zero all those out to bring it back to the default position. And then finally, I can hit the D key to enter a mode that lets me move the pivot of my object. And the pivot is essentially where your object will rotate and scale around. So when I hit the D key, it switches to this version that lets me translate and rotate it. So if I just move my pivot to right here, and hit the D key again to confirm it, my gizmo is now where I moved the pivot to. And then if I rotate, it will rotate around that pivot. And if I scale it, it'll scale in proportion to that point in space. But if I wanted to move my pivot back to the very center of all this geometry, I can go up to here, the button to the left of delete history, and hit center pivot. And that resets the center of the pivot back to the middle of my object. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this cube. You can, of course, make other shapes like spheres or cylinders or toruses. I'd like to call them donuts, or polygon planes, which are just flat geometry, or cones. And each of these, you can go into the channel box and alter them. So maybe change the subdivisions to 4, and now I've got a pyramid rather than a cone. Or at the cylinder, I want less or more divisions. Same with the sphere, more or less divisions. And so with a little tweaking, you can get nice different shapes out of each of these. So as you learn different modeling tools, you can take these shapes and expand upon them and change and tweak them to fit any of your needs. Any model you build is going to start probably from one of these shapes, at least. Maybe a couple of them. But for now, I'm going to bring back just a cube. And it looks like my pivot is a little bit messed up to start. You can see that something has gone wrong with my scale tool. So to fix problems with tools like your scale tool or your rotate tool or translate, it looks like all of them are acting a little funky. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to double click the tool I'm working with. You'll notice the move and rotate and scale tools are all corresponding to icons here, which I can access. And if I double click any of those tools, it will open my tool settings window. And from here, a custom axis has been defined. And I'm not really sure how that happened. Sometimes things just do weird things in Maya. But that's not a problem, because what I can do is I can simply hit reset tool and it refreshes my axis orientation back to the world. I'm going to go and select rotate. I'm going to hit reset tool there as well. And for scale, I'm going to hit reset tool. Now you notice that objects can be manipulated in different axes orientations. And there's a lot of them to list right now, but the only two you really need to worry about to start are object and world. And the simplest way to show that is I'm going to rotate this. And right now my move tool is oriented to the world axis. So that's this little axis down here in the bottom left. However, my local rotation is turned about 27 degrees on the y-axis. Now, let's say I wanted to move my cube along that axis straight along the rotation I have. What I could do is I could go to the object's axis orientation. And to do that, I'm going to hold W and I'm going to left click. And that will open up this little contextual menu for the axis that I want my move tool to work with. And like we saw before, there's world, and then here's object. When I hit object, it changes my tool to work along the object's axis orientation rather than the world's orientation. And of course, if I want to change it back, I can hold W, left click, and select world. Or, as we saw before, I can change it from the tool settings. Next, let's talk about polygons. Every polygon mesh in Maya is comprised of polygons. Every polygon is comprised of vertices, which are these corners, which are just a point in space. Those vertices are connected by the edges, which are these lines between each pair of vertices. And then there are faces, which make up the surface between the edges. Now, if I hold right click, it'll open up a new contextual menu, which lets me switch between multiple different edit modes for each of these components of my object. So if I go to vertice mode and zoom in a little bit, I can select each of these vertices and manipulate them individually. I could also left click and drag to marquee select multiple vertices and manipulate multiple at once. Be careful when using the marquee select though, because if I go a little too far, I'm not paying attention, I can accidentally select vertices that I wasn't looking for and that were behind my object. And then of course we have edge mode, which lets me select edges. And then there is face mode, which lets me select faces. If I wanted to select multiple faces at a time, I could also hold shift and select each one individually. If I wanted to remove one from my selection, I could hold control and left click a face to remove it. Next, let's take a look at the modeling toolkit, which is over here. We saw it a little bit earlier, and bring it back. And here is just an easy place to find some of the tools that are used most frequently when modeling. One of those being the multi-cut tool, which can be found right here, which lets me click on parts of my edges to add vertices, which I can then connect to other edges to make cuts in my mesh. And then once I am happy with my preview of my cut, I'm going to hit enter, and it adds those edges and vertices to my mesh and divides the faces that they cut through. And of course, I can go to vertice mode and edit these all the same. A quick tip, if you want to flatten out uneven vertices along an axis, you can select them all and then go to your scale mode and scale them down. If you do it enough, they'll be perfectly even with each other. Of course, if I wanted all of these to be even and I wanted them to be in the exact middle of this square or this cube, I could instead select all these. Of course, if I wanted these edges to be not only even, but also going along the middle of this cube, there is an even easier way to achieve that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these edges. And now if I want to select all of these edges at once, I can double click. And what that does is it goes around, follows the one edge to each connected edge from that point, and selects those as well. This is known as an edge loop. There are also face loops. So if I were to select this face and then double click the face below it, it will use the trajectory of these two faces to go along and select every face in the loop around the cube. All right, now it's time to delete these edges. Now, if I wanted to, I could just hit the delete key. But if I do that, I'm left with a problem that I won't find out until later when I go back to vertex mode. When you hit the delete key with edges selected, it leaves behind the vertices, which gives us n-gons. N-gons are basically polygons with more than 4 sides. And we really don't want polygons because they can cause problems for our modeling process and how the model renders. And generally they're considered to be sloppy or unclean modeling. So instead of just hitting the delete key by itself, the proper way to delete edges is to hold control and then press delete. And that will delete the vertices along with the edges. Or alternatively, bring those edges back one more time. I can hold shift and right click And this opens up another contextual menu with modeling tools built into it. And one of the tools that you can find here is delete edge. So going back to my multi-cut tool, instead of just clicking willy-nilly, I'm going to hold shift and this black dot appears in the middle of the edge. So when I click here, I can be sure that the vertice snaps right to that black dot, ensuring that my edges stay right in the middle of my faces. Or if I wanted to, I could hold left click and then drag up to move in increments of 10% along this edge. But again, I'm just going to do the 50% and finish. There's another tool that also automatically goes to the very center of an entire loop of faces without having to cut each edge. And it's up here in Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop Tool. If I select that, I can just select on an edge loop and it inserts edges automatically. And if I double click the tool, which is right here between my transformation tools and the outliner, double click, I can alter the number of edge loops this tool adds. So I can bring it back down to 1, just add edge loop there and there. And I can bring it up to 3. Now, I really like that tool, but it takes a couple of clicks to get there. And let's say I wanted to add it to my usual interface. What I can do is I can add it to my shelf here. All I need to do to add a tool to my shelf is to go up to that tool again and hold Control and Shift and then click that tool again. And what it's done is it has added it to the end of my shelf. If I wanted to, I can middle click and drag it to a different position. I actually already happen to have it in my shelf because it's a tool I use pretty often, but by default, the Insert Edge Loop tool is not in the poly modeling shelf. One thing that's really important to talk about is the difference between triangles, quads, and n-gons. Now, they're all made of the same stuff, but triangles have obviously 3 sides, quads have 4 sides, and n-gons refers to any polygon that has more sides than 4. So n is just a placeholder for whatever number you want to fit in. So when you're modeling, you're going to be constantly thinking about these shapes and how you can try to gravitate usually towards quads. Quads are the ideal shape to have usually in your model because they divide easily every time. So you can see if your model is made all out of quads, it can divide by 4 very neatly. And you should be able to always get clean edge loops when your model is all quads. Whereas if you have triangles mixed in, it's a little bit harder to work around that when it comes to doing things like adding edge loops. So for example, I've got this cube over here, which is mostly quads, but it has a couple triangles in here. If I go to multi-cut, I can add edges that way, add edges that way. But if I try to add a edge loop where there's a triangle, it interrupts the edge loop flow, and I can't add an edge loop through this way. In the sort of traditional mindset of modeling, triangles are considered to be unclean or unprofessional geometry to have in your model. So you want to have as few of them as possible in that old mindset. However, in more recent times, I believe the stigma towards triangles has lessened. And if we are talking about a context like games, triangles are much more acceptable to have on your model, especially visible, because when your models are imported into a game engine, all the quads are converted into triangles anyway. However, if we're talking about animation, just straight up animation, VFX, it's best to try to kind of hide your triangles where you can, just because you still want to try and have clean looking geometry. There are exceptions, of course. Sometimes it would make more sense to have a triangle in certain places. For example, with a sphere, right here at the top, we have triangles meeting at the very top and bottom of the sphere. And that just makes more sense than trying to sort of force these to be quads. Like that. What you really want to avoid, though, are n-gons. Triangles, you can usually get away with a few, but with n-gons, it's less often that you'll be able to get away with one unless it is on a particularly flat surface. That is because of the way that Maya works when interpreting how polygons should fold. So if we go ahead and make a new plane real quick, set the subdivisions to 1. We fold this in half. You can see that it does technically make 2 triangles, but you can't always be sure which way it's going to fold. That is until you were to make these triangles like this. All of a sudden it folds up like that. Now, in most instances, polygons are not folding in such drastic ways that you would see an issue with that, but there is a little bit of unpredictability with how the polygons will fold if they are positioned like this. N-gons are that problem, but much worse. So if we raise a couple that way, drop that down. You can see as we alter the shape of this n-gon, it's unpredictable how it will interpret this geometry, especially if we start using multicut to just start adding more polygons without adding edges. It can get a little bit arbitrary. So that's why we want to avoid n-gons as much as possible. Now let's talk about animation for a second. The quickest way to animate something in Maya is to select an object you want to animate and press S. And what this will do, it will set a keyframe on all of these attributes in the channel box. It can tell they're keyframes because they have this red bar next to them now. And if you go down here, just below our view part is our time slider. And so by default, we start at frame 1. And we can go through, move our time slider to a different frame, say frame 70. And then I'm going to translate this over here, translate it up a little bit, and give it a rotation. And then I'm going to hit S again to add another keyframe to frame 70. And then if I slide between the 2 keyframes, we can see the computer interpolate the animation between the 2 positions. I can then hit play to watch it play forward. And there you go. That's how you animate. Simple as that. Next, let's talk about different ways to smooth out your model. Now, when talking about smoothness, it can refer to a couple of different things, technically. One thing smoothing could mean is subdividing your model to round out the hard edges with smaller geometry. To do that, all we need to do is go over to here and press smooth. And then this little temporary box pops up, and here I can scale up the number a little bit to about 3. And with each division, the vertices get rounded out. So my box is now very, very smooth rather than the hard corners it had before. Notice though that this is very dense now that I've smoothed it out in this way. and it would be very, very difficult for me to make changes to this now that the density is so high, or this is high poly as it is called often. So this is not a very practical way to smooth out your model in a lot of instances. Instead, there's a couple other ways we could go about this. Another way is to soften my edges themselves. So if you'll notice, when I unselect my cube, there's a hard line dividing the top of the cube from the side of the cube to this side of the cube. Right, it's right along here. That's because these edges are hardened. So they render with a very, very clear edge to them. But if I go to my edge mode, select some of these edges by holding shift and selecting each one, or just double clicking to select the quote loop, even though it's not a closed loop. I'm going to hold shift, right click, and over here on the right is soften / harden edges, and I can select soften edge from there. And even though the physical geometry is still a very hard point, when we look at it, it is being rendered as if it is a smooth edge. And if I were to select the whole thing, soften edge, the whole cube looks a lot softer now. Now, normally you wouldn't soften the edges on something with this drastic of a point without trying to make it look a little bit more believable. So I'm going to select some of these edges. The engine doesn't know quite how to make that look realistic, so I'm going to scale it down a little bit. I'm just going to grab these corner vertices. There, that looks still very smooth, while still being a fraction of the polygon count of the smooth button. If you are making models for games, this is absolutely something you will use a lot, especially for something like a mobile game, where every polygon is precious, and you need to keep your models as low poly as possible to operate well on the lower end hardware. Finally, there is one more way to smooth out our model. I'm going to undo a bunch so we can get back to the hard-edged cube. And now we're here. I'm going to use the Smooth Preview button by pressing the 3 key. And what Smooth Preview mode is it essentially gives me a preview of what my model would look like if I had smoothed it. So if I click it, you can see, so if I press 1, it goes back. And if I say select some of these faces, hit 3, and I can edit those faces, and you can see how the model is still very workable, but it looks a lot smoother now. And if I hit 1, you can see what the geometry actually looks like. So Smooth Preview is really great for having models that are still low poly and very, very easy to still manipulate and edit and work with, while also getting that high resolution, smooth quality to them. So now that we have made a couple changes, I'd like to save my scene. And to do that, I'm going to go up to File, Save Scene. And it will give me this pop-up. And you notice that it will automatically open up the directory of your scenes subfolder within your project folder. So if I go back by 1, you can see here's my project folder with all the folders inside. And then in scenes, I'm going to give my scene a name. When naming your scene, it is good practice to write out the name of your scene and then put dot and then your initials so that anyone else working on the project knows who touched this file last, and then dot again, and then you will put 0001. for the first time you save this scene. That is because we are going to save increments of this scene, and we're going to save a lot of them. So we want to have a number system baked into our scene name, and we want it to be written out like this with dot and then the number with plenty of zeros, because there is going to be a way for us later on to automatically make new incremental saves of this file without having to manually rename it every time. And then after I've added the numbers, I have the choice to make this file a Maya ASCII file or a Maya binary file. These two are pretty similar and they function effectively the same. The only difference is that the Maya binary format saves in binary language, ones and zeros, whereas Maya ASCII writes in something that is a little bit more readable to a human. So on the off chance you're having a truly bizarre issue, you could upload your Maya ASCII folder to someplace on Substack or somewhere else on the internet, and there is a chance that a wizard out there can read ASCII and can diagnose your problem. It's highly unlikely, so the difference is pretty moot. Some plugins want you to save your files in a certain format, but otherwise it doesn't matter too much, so I'm just going to save it as a Maya ASCII. And when I did that, it got rid of my numbers, so I'm going to bring them back real quick. And I'm going to hit save. So now you can see up here, the name of my scene is at the very top. And if I make a change, I can go up to File and hit Increment and Save. And what that does is it makes a new scene file and increments the number up by 1. So now if I go to Open Scene, I now have 2 files, 0001 and 0002. This is really good if somewhere along the line you do something you don't really like, or something breaks, or you make a mistake. You can go back to an earlier version of your scenes and you can bring back that old version. Now that we've saved, let's delve back into the modeling toolkit. We've already seen smooth, we've already seen multi-cut. Let's take a look at extrude. And extrude doesn't do anything if I don't have a face selected. So I'm going to select a few up here. I'm going to hit extrude. And this gizmo pops up that lets me do some transformations. When I pull out, you see it's actually created new geometry between my selection and the rest of the cube. And then with this box here, I can make little adjustments like the thickness and the offset. Even the divisions in the new geometry, to give myself a little bit more control. Extruding is something you are going to be doing a lot, so it's good to remember that tool in particular. You can also make an extrusion by selecting a face and just holding Shift and then dragging it out. Or by holding Shift and scaling it up and moving it out like this. So there's multiple ways to make extrusions beyond just using the button to extrude. Be careful too when using the extrude tool, because it is possible to hit the extrude button and then click outside of that face and forget about it. And that looks like nothing changed. However, if I go to smooth preview, we can see that there is still a face there. And the faces are just overlapping. And if I drag this out, again, we can see there is unnecessary geometry overlapping here that can cause problems later on. So that's a good thing to keep in mind so that you're not accidentally creating unnecessary hidden geometry. So next, let's say I were to delete a face and maybe another face. And I kind of regret that and I want to fill these faces back in. What I can do is I can go to edge mode, select those 2 faces, and select those 2 faces, and select bridge. And that will take a look at these edges and find a way to bridge the gap between the two. I could also do it with just one if I wanted to. Or if I had a bunch, select this whole edge loop. And it's not in the modeling toolkit, so I'm gonna have to go to Control Shift, and down here is fill hole. Now, mind you, when you do fill hole, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will have quads. See, in this instance, it's giving me just one big n-gon. And so if I were to do it this way, I would have to go with my multi-cut and make 2 cuts to turn it back into quads. Now let's say I wanted to disconnect this piece from this piece. Well, first I need to make a separation between the two between the two parts of the geometry. So I'm going to go to multi-cut. And another way to use multi-cut is to hold Control to get a whole edge loop. This is very similar to the Add Edge Loop tool, although it doesn't have the option of adding multiple loops at a time. And then I'm going to select this face loop and hit the delete key. So now there is a gap in this object. However, it is still the same object technically, even though not all the geometry is connected. And you can see here in the outliner, my cube is still just one cube. To actually completely separate these two, I need to hit the separate key. When I hit separate, it goes through the whole model and looks for any gaps where there's nothing connected, and it makes those into new objects. So now I have a top and bottom part to this. And if I go to the outliner, it has now created a group with both of those objects in it, as well as this transform node. Groups can be really useful because you can select the group to manipulate all the objects within the group, or you could manipulate just part of the group separately. And then this transform node is actually just another representation of the history that is on these objects. So as we talked about before, history tends to pile up and it bogs down your system, and it leaves these junk nodes in your outliner as well. So I'm going to freeze the transformation and it gets rid of that transform node. If I don't want these objects to be in a group, I could always middle click and drag them outside of the group. And now they are separated from the group and the group is empty. And then I could just delete the group if I wanted to. Then it's a little bit confusing calling these polysurface 1 and 2. So I can double click to give it a new name. You may want to adopt a naming convention like geo underscore whatever your name is. Geo top. Just so that your geometry is easily identifiable in your outliner. Because later on you will have other objects in here like lights and cameras that will be distinct from your geometry. So let's say I change my mind and I want to combine these again. I can select both of these and then go over here to combine. And now you can see it has merged them back into one object and has left two new groups in the place of the top and bottom parts, and each of them has a transform junk node underneath. So I'm going to freeze the transformation one more time. And then finally I can bridge and clear my history. Now, because of the way that Smooth Preview works, it can smooth out your edges pretty drastically, and sometimes you don't want to have such a drastic smoothing going on. This is where the bevel tool comes in handy, which can be found here. So before I use it, I'm going to select a bunch of edges around my cube. And with all those selected, I'm going to hit bevel. And what that does is it splits up my edges that I've selected to make this bevel around my cube. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on the fraction and turn chamfering off. So now the shape of the geometry isn't changed, but it's added all of these edges close to the edges that I selected. That's pretty good. And then I'm going to hit 3. And now you can see, while it is still a smooth edge, it's a lot sharper than it was before. As opposed to the very smooth corners up here where it didn't bevel. This technique of adding edges close to your corners to maintain their shape is sometimes called fencing. Now let's say you had another issue where you have got this big gap and you want to bring the two together, but you don't want to add any more geometry. You don't want to bridge this. You want it to be the same number of faces as it is before, but you want these to be connected. To do that, you can use the target weld tool. And target weld has 2 modes, target and center. And we'll start with target. And what you do with target weld is you grab one vertice and you drag it to the other and let go. And it welds that vertice to the other one while moving it over to that vertice. You can also do this in center mode, which finds the middle point between the 2 vertices and snaps them together at that point. Additionally, you could go to your edge mode and merge that way to save a little bit of time, because then you're merging 2 vertices at once. And there you go. Good as new. So let's say you're working on an object that's supposed to be the same on one side as it is on the other, and you want it to be completely symmetrical as you're working on it. I'm going to go ahead and delete that edge real quick. And then I'm going to go over here to symmetry. I'm going to turn this on. You can turn on symmetry either on the world axis or the object axis. So I'm going to turn it on for the object X. That means that it's going to go on for the object's X-axis, which is in this direction. And while symmetry is active, your selections will hover in blue rather than the typical red. That's how you know that it is affecting both sides of your object. I can drag this out like before. And this works for things like extrusions as well. Now let's say something goes wrong, because symmetry doesn't always work perfectly in Maya, and you've got this one face that's just messed up here, and your symmetry is ruined. You try to use your symmetry again, and now you've got red faces right in this area. So you want to fix your symmetry again. What you can do is turn off your symmetry and delete 1/2 of your model. Like that. And with my object selected, I'm going to go up here and hit the mirror tool. And this doesn't always work right away. It doesn't look right away. It just happened that it was perfect this time, but sometimes your axis direction could be positive, and it could make your model disappear, or negative. Either one could be the right or wrong direction. Your axis could be in the Y direction, or the Z. And it could be on the world, or the object, or the bounding box of your object. So say if let me undo a bit. Say if my object was out here, and I'd try to mirror it. If it's on the world axis, it'll mirror from the very center of the world, and that would be a big separation. However, if I switch it to object, it'll mirror in relation to the object's pivot. I'm going to undo a bit and show you one more thing. If you have vertices in the middle of your object that are not quite at the center, and then try to mirror it, Sometimes your merge threshold, which is right here, will not be large enough to merge those vertices normally, and you'll end up with a gap. And going back to object mode, you can see that this vertice, for example, is just one vertice, but these two did not merge. So it's something to keep in mind that sometimes your vertices are not always going to be in the middle like you think they are. And you need to make sure that the merge threshold is high enough to get them to merge properly. But sometimes it's just impossible to get that merge threshold just right. So you have to go in and merge the vertices yourself with target weld. Or another way to merge these together is to hold Shift, right click to open the vertex mode contextual menu and go up to merge vertices, merge to center. And if you want to repeat an operation you just did, I'm going to select those vertices again. And instead of going through all that menu stuff, I'm just going to hit G again. And I will repeat the operation that I just did. That works for things like extrude as well. So if I hit extrude, drag that up, and hit G, extrude again, you can see it's made new geometry. Again, G, G, and so on and so forth. So sometimes as you're working, your normals can get messed up, with normals being the direction that your faces are facing. So every face has a right and wrong direction it can face. Easiest way for me to show that would be to make a polygon plane. I'm going to turn this on its side. If I hold J, I can rotate in increments to get a perfect 90-degree turn. And you can see the back side of this plane is solid black. So that is because this is the back side of the face, whereas this is the front side of the face. This is the side where all of our textures will appear and where lighting can be calculated. This is the good side we want to see, and we want to hide all the back sides. However, sometimes as we're working, errors can occur where, I'm just going to do this intentionally, but it can happen at random sometimes, where your normals will be reversed. And you won't always know it's happened because sometimes it'll happen on your mesh randomly, say in the backside or something usually like that, where you're not looking. And you realize, oh no, why are my normals flipped? They're on the inside now. So to fix this, you could either isolate all these faces that are flipped and go to Mesh Display, Reverse. Or you could go to Mesh Display with the whole object selected and select Conform. And it will just try to make those faces face in the direction of most of your other faces. So let's say I'm fairly happy with this model and I want to duplicate it so I have more of them. All I need to do is press Control D. And then once it's duplicated, all I need to do is move it aside like so. Or if I want to make another one even faster, I can just hold Shift and Transform to drag out more of them. And then from that point, I can just really start going and give myself a nice big plane here. Maybe subdivide it a bunch. Move these shapes out. I'm going to go through and fix that normal issue on all of these. With multiple selected, I can go to Mesh Display, Conform, to fix the normal issues on all of the objects at once. And there, I built out a little bit of a scene. But let's say I want to edit the terrain a little bit. And I want to do it in a way that looks smooth and natural. One way I could do that is I can go to vertex mode and I can press the B key to turn on my soft select mode. And what it does is it creates this radius around wherever I select. And whatever I do to manipulate that one selection, it will pass along that transformation to the rest of the geometry in the radius. So with that, if I've got a little landscape here, I can use this to make little hills, little changes in elevation very quickly. If I want to change the size of my soft selection, I can hold B and then left mouse drag in either direction to change that radius. As I'm working, I can even let objects kind of overlap to make new shapes. And then if I want to, I can turn off my grid plane right here so I have a little better visibility of my scene. There you go. I've got a little environment going. Let's say I want to add objects that I found off of the internet. To do that, I'm going to need to import those objects. And those will not usually come in as a scene folder. Oftentimes, those will come in as another file like a .obj or .fbx. So to import one of these files, first I need to get my file ready. So I have my new file here. It is a skull. I'm going to use the .fbx version of it. And then I have my project folder here. I'm going to go ahead and move this to assets. So I'm going to drag my skull FBX, and for kicks I'll drag the OBJ in as well, and close both these folders. Then from there I'm going to go to File, Import, and it'll pop up this window. Now it may start off on scenes, so you'll need to navigate to the assets folder instead. So thankfully, because my project is set, I can easily do that by just accessing this window over here. Click assets, and I'll select skullnoteeth.fbx. And I'll leave all my settings the same, and I will hit import. And just like that, the skull imports in. It's pretty large because I've been actually working really small. As a reminder, the default measure of units within Maya is centimeters. If I was planning on taking this really far, I would take the time to get the measurement right so that this is to scale. But for this, it's fine to leave it as is. So I'm just going to move my skull back here, kind of embed it in like maybe right here. And simple as that. That's how you import objects. So now I've gone ahead and selected everything in my scene by selecting it all in the outliner on the left. And now I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here and clear the history. And then I'm going to hit Control and G to group all these objects in the outliner. I'm going to give it a new name, call it ENV for environment. And I just did that to organize my scene a little bit better so I can select everything in the environment, deselect it. If I'm working my scene and it's feeling really, really cluttered and I just want to work on one particular part, I could also just select that object. And up here among the icons that line the top of my viewport, I can select Isolate Select. And it'll hide everything but my selection, so I'm free to work on it as I please. I could go into Faces, get these a little bit, get the skull really wide. If you need to turn off your soft select, just press B again, and then I'll turn off the Isolate Select. And we're back to normal. I know this one was very dense, so thank you for sticking through to the end. If it didn't all quite stick for you, that's completely understandable, as Maya has a very steep learning curve. Just have patience with yourself and take everything one step at a time. So with that, I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.